So I'm Sandra Starke. I'm one of our senior bid proposal development managers, which means I help companies that want to work with CPI to prepare competitive funding applications. And my background is that I have a master's in biomechanics, a PhD in sensor-based locomotor analysis, and an MBA. So quite broad. I used to work in research for quite some time. Over to Susan.
Hi, everybody. I'm Susan. I'm really grateful to be here and try and share some of our knowledge. I've been with CPI about 6.5 years now. I have about 20 years of experience with writing grants and tenders and bid proposals, and so I'm trying to bring some of that experience to you to help look at where the best areas are that we can make a difference when we're trying to receive money from sources that are out there, shall we just say. I'm an electrical engineer by background, although I've been working primarily in bid spaces for a long time. And on that, I'll hand it over to Mike.
Hi there, I'm Mike Todd. I'm a bid development manager. I've been at CPI for about 4 years. And before that, I had over 10 years of sort of self-employed freelance bid writer, mainly in the sort of Cambridge, London area. And then before that, about 20 years of sort of direct research and development experience in the defence industry. And I've got a physics background a long time ago.
Mm-hmm. Right. So if we have a look at our agenda today, what we sort of tried to prepare is something that will give you a good start on how you can form winning proposals when you're looking at trying to obtain government support for your endeavors and trying to commercialize new products and processes. So we will cover sort of what collaborative research and development means and what CPI has to offer. And then we'll look specifically at how you actually go about preparing winning applications. We'll look at the research and proposition, the evidence that's required, timelines, sort of your legal and IP considerations, the financials, and how to find grant funding. And then we'll follow that up with some Q&A. Please do type your Q&A questions into the Q&A chat as we go along, and we'll try to make sure that everything gets covered. Sorry, I'm struggling to advance the slide.
Otherwise, Mike, can you just
there we go.
The slides
yeah, it's struggling to advance it because I don't know, it keeps jumping around. Anyway, nothing like a few technical issues. Where would we be without IT? So what does collaborative research and development mean, and what does CPI offer? Mike, can you just move it to the next slide, please, actually? So CPI, we are a government catapult organization. We sit under the High Value Manufacturing Catapult, and CPI effectively does anything to do with chemicals. So we help companies develop, prove, scale up, and commercialize new products and processes, whether those are new materials, or scaling up to prove new assets and products that you're trying to bring to market. There's sort of 3 pillars where CPI really focuses our efforts. They're in the healthcare markets, and basically that looks at sort of your medicines manufacturing and innovation. That includes looking at small molecules, biologics, oligonucleotides, therapeutics with mRNA, saRNA, those kinds of things. We also look at the scale up of the nanotherapeutic delivery systems and intracellular delivery systems. And we also look at medical devices, whether that's in vitro or point of need diagnostics. And that can be to the ISO 13485 standards, so that we can help you get your medical device into market quicker. We also look at anything to do with supporting net zero. And so that can be looking at new materials for batteries. It can be looking at sustainable materials that replace some of the carbon-based materials that we have. We look at packaging materials. We look at sustainable aviation fuels. We look at bio-derived agrochemicals, alternative proteins. We look at food, feed, and nutraceuticals. And we also look at the end of life. So we look at the full circular properties. We look at the recycling. We also look at polymers, textiles, and composites that might be able to be used. In looking at the recycling sides, we can also look at the validation of your circularity claims. We can look at the techno-economic analysis of what you're offering so that they can offer like-for-like comparisons with existing products. Digital is becoming a very strong player these days, especially with AI and machine learning. That helps us to make processes more efficient. We may also look at using IoT devices to improve the communications and to consolidate information more rapidly so people can make better decisions. We can look at the manufacturing of processes, or the manufacturing processes that are used. So we cover a very wide range of products and processes that we can contribute to and help you to differentiate and accelerate that development of your products and processes. For working with CPI, we have quite a few facilities. And Mike, again, I'm struggling to advance the slide. Could you move to the next one for me? These are some of the buildings that CPI owns. We do span quite a few locations in the UK. Our home center is Wilton, which is the building that's on the top left. We then have a couple of the buildings in Sedgefield. That includes our Neville Hamlin building, our Coxon building, and our Discovery 2 building. These are primarily in the materials and medtech devices areas. In Darlington, we have some of our biologics facilities, and up in Scotland, we have some of our medicines manufacturing facilities. That one's in the bottom right. We also have another couple of smaller offices around the country. But the key aspect here to look at is that we actually have buildings, we have labs, we have space, and we have the expertise to actually prove and validate and help optimize whatever you tend to be working on if they're in these sort of areas of interest. When working with CPI, if we can move to the next slide, maybe it'll let me. Sometimes it lets me, sometimes it doesn't. There's several ways you can work with CPI. One is a fee for service. That's working one-to-one with CPI. This offers flexibility and speed. And from an IP point of view, this means that you would be keeping all of that IP. From a collaborative projects point of view, this may be that you don't actually have some of the funding available that you could use to invest in what you need for your development. In that case, we can work with you to try and find government sources or other funding sources that may be able to provide grants. The idea here is that CPI can also continue to build our capability. So we're always trying to advance our state of the art. And from an IP point of view, this would be sort of a form of shared IP development of who, typically he who creates will own is the preferred position. And then there's also funded SME support, and these would be smaller feasibility type studies. And this is where they're typically small pots of money. It's usually more regionally based funding. And that would be something to sort of just get you on the road and try to provide clarity in terms of what your next steps and what your development journey might look like. So when we come to look at a CR&D landscape, it's a little bit more complex than you just pulling out your checkbook and writing a check and asking someone to specifically help you with a specific area. So I liken that to sort of the maze, and sort of going through the maze is looking through all of the funding opportunities that are there and looking for something that a funder also has an interest to advance something. So you've got to align your scope for development along with the funder's interests in terms of what they're looking to do. So sometimes it can require some lateral thinking in terms of how you want to develop a project, but it has to be able to be aligned with both bits. And I, have depicted that as trying to find the right puzzle pieces, everybody has a different interest, everybody has a different key puzzle piece, and all of that has to fit together to form a coherent picture. And finally, there are many aspects that have to be considered in terms of it's collaborative, and that means that we need partners to do it. So that doesn't mean that each partner has to work separately and has a different niche goal that they're going to fill, and that just sort of comes together at the end. It means that we're learning from each other. It means that somewhere in there we have to mesh all those pieces together so that everybody's getting something out of it, but through the working together, you're receiving the synergies of the background knowledge that everyone is bringing to the table. When it comes to finding partners, there's a lot of considerations that you have to look at. There are funding constraints often. A funder may say that you can only have a single SME applying for this one, or you need an SME and a development partner, or there may be a requirement to have different partners from different countries or different makeups. Other things that you need to think about are in terms of what you need to do with your IP. Is this something that can be shared, or is this something that you want to be able to license to somebody else, but in that way you're also gaining some of their knowledge and their background that you can mix in together. We need to look at the financial viability of partners. There's many projects implode because the cash flow is not there, and therefore, although the funding is guaranteed, that funding is received at a later date. Typically it's given in arrears. There may be some seed funding that comes up front that can also be factored into the equation. And there's also a balance of how many partners you actually need to do the work. So you may have key partners that are required to help you get to where you need to be. But when you start looking at the pot of funding and how you're going to distribute that amongst the partners, you start to find very quickly that actually there's not enough money available then for each of the partners to be able to accomplish meaningful work that will help you on your journey. So all of these things have to be considered. And there's also often the potential to have a subcon versus a partnership. And there's some areas and considerations that you want to take into consideration there, because there may be a requirement to have some form of match funding. And if you have a subcon, that may impose an additional burden on your funding, because you would still have to be match funding the subcon aspect of that. So there's many considerations in finding a partner. It's not just going to somebody who has what can fulfill a gap that you have. In terms of where you can look, there are extensive networks everywhere. There's usually a lot of help. Usually if you can start with one partner, they'll have links. Innovate UK are very good through their Business Connect program. They work with many businesses, so they may be able to help you do that. There are databases that you can look at on companies' houses for people in the same or different market that you might have, and local councils are often helpful. Many times for calls that are sponsored by maybe Innovate UK or by your Horizon Europes, they will have brokerage events, and that would be bringing people together. And there are also brokerage platforms that can be considered. So trying to work through all of the partners that you require is not just straightforward. So the key considerations for a successful award: you have to look from a funder's point of view, you have to look at your project point of view, and you have to look at your partners. And really these things are spread out across there. I would say from a funder's point of view, the main thing that you really have to look at is what the key objectives of that fund are. Nobody just gives you free money. Ultimately, there's a purpose to that money. And from a government's point of view, they're expecting their return on an investment. And so you have to bear that in mind as you're presenting your project, because that's you need to show them why that's going to be attractive to them. They also have an interest in solving particular problems because those problems are seen as important to the society and the people that they support. And when they do that, you know, that's going to help them get elected again later on because they're actually solving those problems. When you come to the project concept, you need to look at how you are actually advancing the state of the art. If anybody can do this and it's not really contributing to the state of the art, they would expect that to be funded by either larger businesses or someone that's already commercialized it or somebody else that, you know, can already has the solution. So they won't, you know, they don't want to fund something where the solution is out there. They want to fund something that has a risk and a reward, and that's what makes it applicable to grant funding rather than just somebody else giving you the money to do it. When you look at public money, it's really important that you look at how the acceleration is going to happen, because otherwise they would expect this to be something that would just be something you could do by talking to other partners and speaking to people who would benefit from your commercialization of that. And value for money is always paramount, and as well as your route to market and how you're going to accelerate that journey. When you look at partners, you're also looking at, you know, sort of the Venn diagram. Where are the overlaps and where are the contributions that someone's going to make? What infrastructure do you need? What freedom to operate? And what is the stake in the game? So there's many considerations, and we'll be going through each of these in a lot more detail for later on. Within the CR&D innovation spaces, the ones that we typically deal with are either on the left-hand side. What's portrayed here is the Horizon Europe, where there's a funding and tenders portal. When you go on that portal, they do have all of the calls listed. They have very detailed information on the specific objectives of the call, the scope that has to be, the full scope that has to be addressed. It will talk about the links to other calls and other platforms that they would like to see considered within the project itself. And they will also include other reference documentation. The calls themselves tend to require quite a bit of effort to pull together, and therefore the calls are open for 4 to 6 months from a single stage point of view. And the calls themselves will list all the requirements in terms of how many countries need to be involved, what your maximum amount is, the duration of time that you will have to deliver the calls, and the specific outcomes that they're expecting to arise from that call. On the right-hand side is really looking at sort of where Innovate UK and UKRI sit. Their calls also have search functions. They will have a detailed list of the scope and the requirements for the calls. They will have additional documentation or strategic priorities that back it up. And typically these are smaller, but the total proposal preparation is significantly less. Excuse me. Okay. And again, we'll look at some of what you can find from the calls in greater detail later. Apologies. And at this point, and in very good time, I'll hand this over to Sandra to take you through the beginning of in preparing your research proposition. Perfect.
Thank you, Susan. I'll try to take control, and if it doesn't work, then Mike, if you can continue. Oh, I already have control. I don't think that's working either. It doesn't even show me the controls. So Mike, if you can just move the slides onwards, and then I'll just talk over them. So what we're doing now, you had a good introduction, is that we take you through the most important elements of preparing a bid with a how to prepare a series of little guidance sections that are based on our experience over the last, well, better part of 10 years of preparing hundreds of these applications with partners and CPI. So the first important consideration for funding applications is that you give the funder a really good idea about the research you have done to date and the proposition that you're asking funding for. Because ultimately, a funding application is very similar to an investment pitch where you're asking someone for their money. It's just that in this scenario, the money is coming from the public purse. Whereas if you go for an investor, it's coming from a private purse. But really, you're still asking for someone's money to believe in your idea. So you have to be really solid on the research and proposition. Mike, so if you progress to the next slide. The first really important element of that is to outline the state of the art. And that is relevant in pretty much all funding calls, because a lot of this content is, of course, expected for all Innovate UK applications, but really this is expected for NIHR applications, for Horizon Europe applications, EIC applications. Anyone wants to know how you sit relative to the state of the art. And what's important to consider there is that you really do your research on the competitor landscape, because we get a lot of companies that come to CPI and say, oh, don't worry about competitors, we're miles ahead, we're the only ones doing something. And then you do a quick Google search, and it's actually not the case. And most funders can do a quick Google search, especially if you're looking for reasonably high amounts of funding. So it's really important to outline who your competitors are, because also if you play in a space with no competitors, it might suggest that actually your idea is not really worth a lot because no one else is doing it. So competitors are not the bad thing. And if you think about competitors, you can think laterally. So competitors could be relevant if they have a different design with the same function. So if we think, for example, about protection from the sun, you might be doing some super duper new formulated sunscreen. Now, a competitor to that is just an umbrella, for example, or it could be a pergola. So you can think about what else is protecting your customers from the sun. You can also think about same design, different function. So who else is making formulated? You have to pop on your face without causing any adverse reaction. You can have a think about what is in the market already, but also what is in development. Because often there will be R&D in universities, R&D in technology organizations, R&D by startups and incubators. That is not necessarily a commercial offering yet, but it is highly relevant to funders because, of course, they will also ask for funding. So how do you differentiate both from commercially available products, but also from products that are still in the R&D phase? Next slide, please. Then if you think about the state of the art, there are different ways to display them. And what you see below are just some examples just from a Google image search that illustrate nice ways to present this. So once you've compiled a list of all your potential competitors or the competitive landscape, then it really also comes to outlining your unique selling point or USP and the differentiators. So what makes you better, bigger, faster? Basically, what makes you preferable to what's already out there? And if you look at the images below, you can either draw up a competitor matrix. So I quite like the one bottom right, where you simply just list all the most relevant competitors, and then so across, and then down, you just list the most relevant functions of the invention. And then you can just mark against the competitors who's got what. And of course, you will be the one who's got everything, and all your competitors will have gaps. And that's a really effective way to visually show why you're superior. But you can also use other ways to display that. Oops, if we just pop back for a second. You can use other ways to display that where you can, for example, rank yourself against others. So you can outline that you might be cheaper than others, but in a similar space technology-wise. So that would be your USP. Or you could outline that you might be as expensive or more expensive than others, but you really have a technological advantage. So you can use that with a graph like in the bottom left, where you just rate two different categories against each other. Next slide, please. Then the next really important thing, and a lot of people, again, gloss over this, and funders really want to see that, is the market analysis and the go-to-market strategy. And I think pretty much all funders will ask you this in various different ways, but they want to know what is the market that you would be selling into, and is that big enough to justify an investment? Because if you get an investment or public funding of £500,000, and over the next 10 years, there's 2 people that will buy your product at £500, then there's no point. So they want to see, is there a market to justify the proportionate grant? And now when it comes to that, then what people typically say is they just look at the top level market. So if you're in, say, medical devices, you will just look at the market for medical devices. 50 gazillion pounds, not a problem. And again, funders are not interested in that because it's too broad. So really, what they want to see is, of course, target markets and size backed up by references and predicted growth rates, but it has to be specific. And what we tend to recommend is that you use the sum approach, or sum. So it's your total addressable market, serviceable, obtainable market, and then the definitions vary of what the last one is, but that's basically your serviceable serviceable obtainable market is the last one. So you break it down from a relevant market to a chunk of the market that you could sell into, but you might not reach everyone, to the chunk of the market that you feel you could reach in the near term. And when you think about those markets, so for example, if you have a medtech device, rather than going after medtech, you then have a look whether, for example, you might be doing a stent for heart. So your overall market would be everything relevant to, say, bypass surgery, and then you would start to break it down to the point where you have a market chunk that you feel you could actually service in the near term. And there's lots of really good books on that. There's some links down here as well. And then when you look at predicted growth rates, what people normally want to hear there is the compound annual growth rate, or CAGR. And again, Google should typically reveal those. You might have to purchase a market review though, worst case scenario. But yes, so you would, for example, say the growth rate for the bypass surgery market over the next 5 years has a CAGR of XYZ. So that's what they want to hear there. Clear timeframes and growth. The target market's main supply and value chains, that's another very popular question that no one answers, and they do want an answer for that, even if it's short. And business models. So they just want to see, do you actually understand the selling mechanisms and how people would make hold of your product? So the main supply and value chains, that's where do you sit if a doctor wants your product, or if a hairdresser wants your product, how do they actually get it? And it's important to do that research, and it's, again, go out to the real world, speak to people, and find out what the procurement mechanisms are, but also what the business models are. And then this might just be a few sentences, but they have to just be really hard-hitting so that the funder is confident that you understand the commercial reality of where you're heading. Next one is barriers to entry, also a popular one to ignore. These can really nicely be linked to your competitors as well. But what this is getting at is what is stopping you and others from breaking into the market, and why can you overcome these barriers? So you would outline them. You might, for example, say, if you have, I don't know, a hairdressing product, the barrier is that there are established brands, that hairdressers might have contracts with specific brands, that is all tied to agents. So you list the barriers, and then you can say, and we overcome them because we are already part of the UK's leading agent network, and we are already liaising with 50 local hairdressers. So it's, again, you just show that you understand the commercial reality of breaking into a market as a new company, because it is difficult, and you show that you have an understanding of how you can overcome, well, an understanding of barriers and how to overcome them. And then the last 2 questions. So there's a lot to market analysis, what you can already see. And this is important to get right. And you will also need it for investment pitches. So it's a long section, but it's important. The last two parts are current UK position in targeting these markets. And this is typically just asked by Innovate UK, so it's less important for others. But Innovate UK wants to see that there is a benefit to the economy of what they're funding. So they want to understand if they're funding your business in the UK, might that advance the UK in terms of European leadership or global leadership? Might it help with reshoring, something that is currently quite far down the supply chain, halfway around the world? So have a think about how your business will actually help the UK progress, but also how it fits in with the current UK position in the sector that you're entering. And then finally, this is also quite a Innovate UK specific question, the size and main features of other markets, but investors might be interested in that as well. And this is getting at, once you've got your core product or idea out there commercially, are there any other opportunities? So is there an easy way to scale up your business or diversify your business by addressing different needs? So if we look back at the sunscreen example, yes, you might have an amazing sunscreen, but you might, in the process of that, have developed some great formulation that is brilliant for people with skin allergies. So you might then use that as a carrier lotion for other medicinal products. So yes, this question, again, it's good to have a think. It's usually just a few sentences to outline them, but it just shows the funder that you're thinking beyond the immediate release of your current invention. Next slide, please. Segmentation. So everyone who has been in an incubator or been on any entrepreneurial program will know this. Everyone else has probably never heard of this. Market segmentation compared to market sizing means that you're starting to break down the market in potential customer segments, typically. It could also be market segment, but typically it's customer segments. So we have to differentiate, are we looking at economic activity areas? So that could be, if you look at the, say, building materials market, that could be high rises, bungalows, cottages, I don't know. So that could be your market segmentation based on areas where people play economically. But typically what's more important is your customer segmentation. So that would be the clusters of potential buyers. Because it's, again, if you understand your buyers, then you can align your offering with that. And that gives everyone a lot of reassurance that actually once your product gets to market, someone will pay for that. Because ultimately, that's always the big question, who will pay for that? So if we look at the customer segmentation, market segmentation, like I said, it's looking at the sector breakdown. For medtech, it could be medical imaging, assistive, etc. Oh, and Clara has a question. Shall we answer them later or now? Not so many. I'll just have a quick look. Hi, Clara. By the way, Clara has worked with us before. So customer segmentation, could it also be B2B and B2C split too? Yeah, definitely. So whether you're going direct to business or direct to, well, not direct, but if you go business to business or direct to customer, that could form part of it. Because it would be quite a different set of needs of the customers. So if we look at customer segmentation, you're looking at buyers with similar needs. For example, wearables could be split into people that either want everyday fitness trackers to just go jogging, medical monitoring, which has very different requirements in terms of calibration, reliability, functionality, usability, elite sports, or phone apps. And for customer segmentation, there's a few links down here as well. And I've got more on the next slide, Mike. For customer segmentation, you're then immediately linking to customer value proposition. So once you identify different clusters of buyers, and it's super important to go out to these clusters and talk to them. So once you've got some ideas of what you think they might want, check they actually want it. Because half the time they don't, or they want something different. So it's important to de-risk it. But in order to communicate it, you need your customer value proposition. So I've got 4 examples here, because again, customer value propositions are difficult to formulate, and often people get it all mixed up. So the examples I've got here is, firstly, all of these might be titled customer value proposition, but only one of them is it. So the first one, our system has an optical resolution of 2 microns, temporal resolution of 1000 hertz, while simultaneously depositing the colors green, blue, orange through quantum tubulus. It's just a made-up example. So this is not the customer value proposition. This is a technical specification. And your customer, most of the time, probably doesn't care about it. So it's not. The next one, we believe in that in 10 years' time, not a single person in the world should die of heart disease due to lack of healthcare access. It's again, this is very noble, and it's probably more a vision statement, which is again, it's important for the company. You need a vision statement, you need a mission statement, not a customer value proposition, because it's not telling anyone what they're getting from you. It's not relatable. The next one, our company will be the #1 supplier of diabetic home monitoring solutions in the UK by 2030, providing equitable access and informed decision-making for all diabetic patients. It's again very noble. Probably your customers don't care about it, because this really is a mission statement. So again, you use that when trying to communicate company values and what the company is about. It's not the customer value proposition. And finally, our device will provide a 50% cost reduction and 3-fold improvement in clinical outcomes for GPs by allowing them to continuously monitor patients at risk of seizure, early detection, adjust treatment regimes, minimizing drug use, and reduce unnecessary clinical visits. So here we have a customer value proposition. We're saying this is targeted at GPs, and if GPs buy from us, this is what they get. They will pay less than normal. They get a massive improvement in their KPIs or clinical outcomes. And this is achieved through these functionalities that are the key functions. So when you develop your customer value proposition, have in the back of your mind that it's not any of the others. It's not a specification, not a vision, not a mission. And to help you formulate it, there is some really useful tool set from Strategizer. Where you can, I guess you'd normally workshop it. So you either workshop it or you just on your desk think about it, about the customer pains, gains, and needs, and then you start to convert that into a written proposition. And the toolset has a lot of cards and guidance to get you to that point. There's even a whole book on it. It's that important. There is, I think it's a 150-page book by Strategizer. Creating a good value proposition. There's a link at the bottom as well. And the book isn't too bad. I think it's £15. Right. So I've rambled on about this a lot, but it's very important. And now the final slide. If you work in health, I know at least one of you are working in health, there is some additional considerations. So first of all, in health, it's really important to find and summarize the relevant published literature. Because if you just go after simple consumer goods that are not going to kill anyone if they go wrong, it's not so important. But for health, it's always good to show that there's some scientific backing to your idea that shows that there will be a prospect of getting into a more red tape market. Then second, determine the appropriate study design. And most likely that would really benefit from consulting your local research and design service. I think that's got a different name now because the NIHR has changed around things a lot as well. But yes, so there's a whole system under the NIHR, which is the research arm of the NHS, that supports people in designing valid clinical studies. So work with them, because especially if you go after NIHR funding, if you don't, the chances are pretty high that you just won't get anywhere. Then start talks with prospective clinical study and trial sites early. It absolutely takes forever. And if you want to run anything like that, having a personal relationship with a clinician that is a champion for your idea, in my experience, is the absolute make and break of any clinical trial. It will be the difference between 3-month and 2-year administrative lead up to the trial, and it will be determining whether or not you reach patient numbers. It will determine the quality of your data, everything. So start to focus early, find someone you can trust who likes you, likes your idea, buys in your idea, and develop these personal relationships. Then identify clinical pathways. It's also something that for NIHR funding is often overlooked. And it's a common question. And for that, you just have to talk to clinicians. So where does your solution sit within the clinical pathway? And what are the elements it will influence? Identify data needed for health economic assessment. Again, that's something people tend to forget. I'm doing the same as Susan now. It's a lot of talking. So I think I lost my voice.
We're a consistent team.
I know. The health economic assessment, I might have to take a break. Then I think we're on to the next section anyway. I'll just go after that later.
Where are you kind of pacing yourself, and or just make you aware that I've added a question into the Q&A section. Basically, it's about can I or should I use AI to help with developing proposals? I mean, yeah, we can get the answer later on, but maybe Mike, you can take over now before we answer that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take over. I mean, it's an interesting one on AI. I think we'll maybe just discuss it later, but it's certainly one that's been asked quite a lot, and we're even asking it internally whether we and how much we look at AI. I'll just get my slides up again. Okay, so this section, Sandra talked quite a lot actually about supporting evidence for things like the market and your route to market. This is more about providing evidence for your technology and how you support kind of your project proposal. And to me, there's two sort of main things in a proposal. One is getting the storyline. So you want something that's sort of engaging to your audience, so they actually sort of take an interest in your proposal and say, oh, this is something I'm quite interested in supporting. But that only gets you so far. I mean, it's an essential step, but it only really gets you so far in terms of getting the marks that you need to progress. So you need to support that story with really strong evidence all the way through your proposal, because that'll make the difference in the end of, you know, whether you get a 7 or an 8. You know, it's just that extra bit of evidence to support your storyline. So one thing, funders rarely sort of fund just an idea of somebody coming to them saying, "Oh, I've got this great idea. Can you give me, you know, £1 million?" That's unusual. So usually, you know, they'll expect you to have done some work before, and they want you to describe and provide evidence to show what you've done, and really in relation to the state of the art, because they might not be experts, so they don't really know what else is around. They can have a look, but if you can show them where your work fits in and how it's different to anything else, that really helps to, you know, persuade them. So the evidence of basically what you've done so far, that could be things like modeling, feasibility studies, proof of concept studies that you've already done. Academic publications are good. Ideally, if you've got some patent applications, or if not, then some patent searches that you can quote to say sort of, you know, this area is one where, you know, you can develop something new. And also an opportunity to present some of the work that you've done so far in sort of graphical form or with some data, and ideally benchmarking that to sort of the competition that's out there. And there's not a huge scope often in proposals. There's often sort of very limited space. So you need to be quite selective with what you've got and what you present. And also experts themselves might, you know, assessors may not be experts. So you need to make sure it's something that's kind of understandable to someone who's, you know, maybe a technology expert, but not exactly expert in your field. And also, as Sandra mentioned, some technical and market comparisons or benchmarking with something that's closest to you. So you can say, you know, this competitor does this, which is close, but ours does this better. So really to pull out what your benefits are. And then you can describe any sort of previous collaborations you've got to how do you get to the state where you are at the moment, any previously funded grants and the outcomes of those. And so that's sort of saying how you got to where you are. You really need to make it clear, because sometimes it's not always made clear, is how the proposed project, what you're asking for the money for, how that will progress the work to the next stage, and what will that, at the end of the project, what will that next stage be. So you need to be quite clear that you're not going to, you know, solve all the problems, but this funding here will specifically get you to the next level. And this one, it's deliberately blurry. It's not your eyesight, and I've redacted some of the information. But I think it's useful to show kind of what good looks like. And this is taken from an actual sort of client application, which is why it's blurred out. But this is one that was for a SMART grant. There's a section called Idea and Innovation. So there's about 400-word section where you do some sort of text explanation, and then you're allowed to put in an appendix with images and supporting sort of data, only on 2 pages. So this is just an example to show you what this scored 9.7 out of 10, and that's over 3 assessors. So that's an average of the assessment scores. So it's one they really liked. And so for just to show the areas they've included in here. First of all, you can see it's very graphic heavy. It's not lots of text saying, you know, we've got a great mission and we're going to be the next this, that, and the other. It's actual, you know, evidence and in a graphic form. So there they've got market information showing how the market's made up, market positioning, where they exactly are positioning within that market, performance benchmarking, you know, this is the competition, this is us. Some scientific detail, because sometimes the assessors will be, often the assessors are interested really in the exact sort of science behind it, and have you got supporting information on that. Work to date, if you've got sort of images or data and graphs and things to show, this is what we got, because immediately it gives assessors an opportunity to see what sort of scale you're working at, and you've actually done something, you're not just sort of talking about it. And here they had sort of potential advantages if they could reach these specific targets. Then this is advantages they would have over the competition. So this is quite a lot of work to do these things and pull them together. But the more you can do to really support your arguments with real facts, the better. And these are the ones, as I say, that score the best. So if you've given evidence for your idea, you know, it's a great idea, but then you also need to demonstrate that actually there's a demand for this. So it's quite often referred to as traction. You know, what's going to pull this thing through? So the evidence for that are things like, you know, who's likely to be your sort of first customers, who's your early adopters? Have you got letters of intent? Have you got to that stage, or can you just describe, you know, who you're talking to and their interest? If you've got any specific sort of advocates for your solution, they may be sort of general industry or specific, like people in sort of clinicians, etc. They really help if you can name some of those. Expressions of interest, you know, usually you'll have talked to sort of potential customers or partners on pulling your product through. Can you get some evidence from them? And again, who are your discussions with? And when you can actually name people, you know, in this, it's much better than saying, you know, we are talking to the industry leaders. If you can actually put names there, it makes a difference. You know, what investment have you secured so far? You know, that obviously gives some evidence that you know you've got people believing you. And have you won awards? You know, be bold and say what you've won and how good you are. So if you haven't got all of these, start doing it now and try and build these networks for the future, because it really strengthens your opportunities to win funding. I think Sandra's covered a lot of this, but so evidence for your route to market, understanding the market that you're in, your own roadmap, if you can sort of lay out that, and sometimes the graphics sections, the appendices are a good opportunity to do this. A very simple visual roadmap of here we are, this is where we're going, and perhaps against years and different objectives for your technology. And so you want to consider your technology and the steps you want to do in the project, but also, what's the future steps after that? So your design for manufacture, your supply chains, your compliance is an important one. So do you understand the compliance journeys you need? So laying that out in a sort of graphical way or describing it very succinctly is really useful. So it's going beyond just your projects itself to what's the future. And if you can show assessors that you've really understood that roadmap, then that helps. Oh, that's good time. I was about to start coughing, but we're back onto Susan on the next one.
I don't know what's happening with all of us. We do apologize. Mike, I think you're going to have to still advance my slides, if that's okay. So if you can move on to the next slide. What we want to look at right now is timelines. I really hope that you've sort of gathered that, it's not just a walk in a park to go and try to obtain funding for your projects. There's significant work that has to be done. And, from in the beginning, we said, if you miss that deadline, you're not in it. You have to be in it to win it. So there is a bit of preparation that's required. As Mike has emphasized, building the networks are in collaborative research and development, it's the collaborations that are important. So networks are key, and understanding who can help you and what aspect they can help with takes time to build up. You have to carve out areas, you have to look at where you help each other, you have to look at areas that you might want to protect with each other. So working with others early on, that work can go before a call ever even appears. You've got to work on that roadmap that you're building. There's a journey that you're already on. Who do you need at the different stages, and start building those relationships so that you can call on them at the appropriate times and for the appropriate work. So when you start thinking about, we need some grant funding for this, put your networks in place, build your proposition so that you have clarity of exactly who you need and what aspects they need to look at. That can be up to a year before your project actually comes. Once you start developing your project, you're looking at the deadline, you need to start working backwards from the deadline, and really look at the size of the players that you have involved, and be mindful that, larger companies will have larger requirements and more bureaucratic red tape, is my experience. So you will have to allow time for them to prepare costs and to have those costs approved. When you get to proposal sign off, again, that's important to make sure that all of your partners are clear and have permission to proceed, and that they all have the resources to support that if the project was successful. So also look at the time where the project might start. Most of them are constrained, in terms of a project must start typically with Innovate UK, it will be within 3 months of the award date. So you need to look at that and ensure that your partners are not only ready to submit the proposals, but that they have in mind the timeframes for the work that they would have to accomplish, and that should all need to be signed off. When it comes to submission, today most places use online platforms for submission. We've also found that, especially in the past year, the number of submissions going into different calls, has greatly increased. And what that means is that there's a lot of burden on the systems from just an IT point of view, and the systems crash. If your proposal is not submitted on time, it will not be in it to win it, and so therefore you can't be considered. So if you can submit early, that's wonderful. The earlier you can submit, many platforms will allow you to put in a first draft of your proposal. You're not calling it that, but should something go terribly wrong, at least you have something in, and then you can revise it and update it and replace it with something else as you go along. But please try to get submissions in early. We always do struggle with that because by definition, you want to keep making it better. The other proposal timelines that you need to consider are what you're putting in for your actual project Gantt. Funders want to see that the work looks like it's evenly, that it's credible. So if you're saying you're going to do a desktop study and your desktop study is going to take 6 months of a 12-month project, you're not going to have much time left to implement the findings of what you have. So what they want to do is be able to sense check how you've built your project, that your project looks credible, that your project looks viable. They don't want to fund something that seems so risky because there's not going to be time to actually do the work that's required. They also want to know who's going to lead each part, and they want to see where the overlaps occur, and therefore who's going to be controlling that. Because if they think that a partner, perhaps there's a small SME that they know only has 1 or 2 people in it, if they're doing 3 simultaneous tasks, they know that that's introducing a lot of risks to the overall success of the project. So you're actually, through your Gantt, trying to build the story that gives a compelling case that what you're proposing is doable and is realizable, and that the outcomes that can be derived from the size of the tasks and the expertise that you're including within the task is credible. So also where there are dependencies, where something feeds something else, do put that in. And wherever you have a dependency, that is going to likely have a risk associated. So make sure that you also bring those forward to carry in your risk registers. When you risk register, they want to know that your project is viable, but they also want you to know that your eyes have been opened, that you are considering the bigger picture of what might go wrong, and that you're considering how you might address that. So those are just some really important parts to make sure that you convey, because it's, we have to give the full story of what you're trying to do. And there, I'll hand it back to Mike to look at the IP.
Okay, it's back to me. I'll just get on the right controls. Okay, so this is about IP, intellectual property and legal, the really exciting parts. But certainly IP, we're talking about collaborative projects here. So IP is kind of critical, and it causes some of the most sort of headaches in proposals, and actually that's transferring through from proposal to actually starting a project. Now, I'm not an IP or legal specialist. Fortunately, at CPI, we've got some very good ones, but I can go through the things we need to consider, and you would need to consider and put in a proposal in. Intellectual property is probably one of the key outcomes really for collaborative research projects, because what you're doing is creating something new, hopefully. So you need to consider sort of what the IP strategy is, and that can be sort of registered IP, things like patents, and unregistered things, most often sort of what people might call trade secrets or know-how. So in the proposal, you need to describe sort of the intellectual property that you have and your consortium partners have and bring to the project. So that's kind of known as background IP. And then you need to describe what your expectations of IP generation during the project. So that's often referred to as foreground intellectual property. If you're bringing, partners are bringing their own their own background, then it's worth thinking, even before you get into discussions, do you need a sort of non-disclosure agreement if you're going to start talking about developing a project? It varies. Some of our people we work with, insist on that, that's fine. We can do that. It doesn't take too long to set up. And others are saying, well, you know, we're not going to share anything in great depths at the proposal stage, so we can continue without that. But it's certainly worth, before you even start meeting with customers or collaborators, to consider if you need a non-disclosure agreement. Another question that comes up is, if I'm putting something, my background IP into a proposal, is that sort of sharing it? Is that, it's public domain? Generally, proposals are not published. Sometimes there will be sections that says that this is a public section, it may be published. Often that is for proposals that are successful in the application. They might say, before the project starts, we might publish publicly this section, but they make it clear in the proposal what that section is, and usually you'll get a chance to sort of edit that beforehand. But generally, I think you can put stuff in the proposal and it's not an open publication, and the assessors themselves will have their sort of confidentiality agreement associated with assessing the proposals, and they should self-declare any sort of conflict of interest that they have. The sort of related question that comes up, they'll ask you to say in a proposal, show that you have freedom to operate with your innovation. So that really means is, if you commercialize this, do you think you'll be able to sell them without incurring any sort of legal liability, so that some third party is not going to say, hold on, you're using our IP here. And it's actually quite difficult to demonstrate that fully. But it really means they want to see, at the very least, you've done your own IP search, or via yourselves, or even better with a sort of patent consultant that says, we've had a look at the conflicting IP, and we believe you've got freedom to operate. And if you've got your own patents, that really helps to show you should have freedom to operate, but it doesn't by itself say that you will have, because there may be some other patents out there that conflict with that. So ideally, I think if you're not expert, you try and get a patent consultant to have a look at that. If you can, at the minimum, is things like the competitor analysis that Sandra laid out before, showing what your innovation does and how that differs from everybody else. That sort of helps, showing you've got a niche position. But you need to have something just to give them confidence that you're not going to come up with something that's immediately going to be subject to legal challenges. In terms of legal sort of terms and agreements, I guess there's three things that you need to look at. The terms and conditions, there's two things. The competition terms and conditions, so exactly what's allowable in this competition. So, for example, different funding rates, or who can lead, that sort of terms and conditions on the competition. And then there'll be terms and conditions of the deliverable project. And these can be, quite extensive depending on the funder. And really, it's up, it's up to you to look at the T's and C's and make sure you understand them, because you'll be expected to sign off on them and deliver according to the terms and conditions. The second sort of legal agreement is the collaboration or consortium agreement, CA. That, because it's a consortium, you need to draw up an agreement, usually after you've won the award, but before project starts. So they'll say before the project starts, you need to have a signed consortium agreement signed by all the partners in the project. That says, how the consortium will manage, and importantly, it'll say how the IP rights will be managed and divided between the partners. There's some model consortium agreements that you can start with, and you can alter them. But at the end of the day, it's a consortium agreement between the parties to the award. It can be, and it's just sort of highlighted, it can be a hurdle to grant awards. So you get the fact that you've passed the assessment, you need to prepare a consortium agreement. You might have a few weeks to do that, and then suddenly it's like, oh, how does this actually work, and are we going to argue over the IP at that stage? So having at least an idea of how you're going to do things like that early on is certainly worthwhile. And then the third legal agreement is often called the grant offer letter or a grant agreement, depending on the funder. So that's the formal sort of contract between the funder and the consortium. It may be with the whole consortium, it may just be with the lead, depending on how the work is structured. So that'll lay out, what the plan of work is and funding agreements, and that'll generally attach terms and conditions of the award to that as well. So a bit more about the collaboration agreement. Quite often we get the question, what will the funder, whoever they are, take project IP? And this is kind of rarely for public funders that actually take IP. So usually, that's shared between the consortium. But they may, on some competitions, they may actually put specific exploitation conditions to say, for example, if the consortium has not exploited within 5 years, just making this up, but we reserve the right to take the IP back and share it with someone else. So it's important to consider what you're signing up to within the terms and conditions. A big issue, I guess, is in CR&D, collaborative R&D projects, it's expected that all the partners are likely to be involved in creating IP to a certain extent. That's the whole idea of a consortium. You're not just contracting people to do some work and delivering it to you. It's actually sort of co-created innovation. So that means there's expected to be a level of IP sharing and IP exposure. If you need to work with someone, you probably will need to share some of your IP of how things work and how you make things. So that's very big difference really to a commercial contract or to a subcontract where you can maybe deliver to a specification, but you don't need to know all the details behind that. So when you're starting discussions and putting proposals in collaborative R&D, you need to make sure that everybody's on board in your company with, you may have to share IP, and in fact you probably will need to at some point, at least for the project and maybe even afterwards. So you need to be clear basically what you're signing up to. And as Susan said at the beginning, each partner will want something out of it. They might not be directly exploiting the IP, but they'll want some sort of benefit from taking part in the project. That's what I've said. They want some sort of benefits in line with their needs. So CPI, we're probably not going to commercialize the technology, but we'll need to quite often need to use the IP generally to support other projects and other clients. So we want it not to sign our life away on one project. We need to be able to work with different customers. So ideally, some of these discussions really could come early, so they don't need to wait until you've decided, you've worked out whether you won the award. But if you can start discussing these with partners early, it makes sense for everyone. As I said, model collaboration agreements are available. Innovate UK, they don't mandate it, but quite often consortium agreements are built around one of the so-called Lambert models, and there was a link there to where they are. But there's a number of different agreements depending on what the consortium wants. Lambert D is the one we would prefer to start with, which is basically each member of the consortium owns the IP in the results that it creates. So what you create in the project, you own the IP to that, but you grant a non-exclusive license to the other partners, a right to use that to exploit the exploitation. It's all getting quite detailed, but there's things we can advise on or point you to on those. Forward. And Horizon Europe, there's a DESCA. I don't know what DESCA stands for, but there's a model agreement for Horizon Europe projects, which is similar to the Innovate, but much more complicated. just to say on NIHR, sort of healthcare ones, I'm not going to go through this in detail, but basically they want some say in the setting up of the consortium agreement. So just be aware for things like that. They want to be involved just to make sure that the funding they put in is something that's going to be high expectation of being commercialized. And we're back to Sandra.
Perfect. I can speak again. I'll whiz through these slides as well because I'm conscious that we're starting to get short of time. So Mike, if you can move the slides on, I'll go through the first ones in detail because there are the common mistakes. And then we just look at the few scenarios. You go to the next slide. Thank you. So if you think about financials for grant funding, it's super important to look at sections that outline eligible costs, because a lot of companies make the mistake of thinking, we can brush over that, it'll be fine anyway, and then it won't be fine. So make sure you find, especially if you apply for something for the first time, the guidance on eligible costs, and then just make sure that what you're costing is in line with that. That comes down to overheads rates, staff rates, depreciation rules, etc., etc. You may or may not be able to buy capital on certain grants, so definitely make sure. And the common oversights that we see is firstly labor rates. So for labor rates, you can only claim what you pay your staff through PAYE. So if your startup or company is already set up to have a PAYE system running, that's pretty much it. What's going out through that is what you can ask for, not more. So you can't charge industry rates, you can't charge consultancy rates, you can't just make things up, because Innovate will look for evidence. So that's the rate that will go in, PAYE. And if you do not use a PAYE system to pay your staff, then Innovate UK will stipulate a flat rate. Other funders may use a different principle, but then it's really important that you check that, because then most likely you can only charge the stipulated flat daily rate, and that's it. And also, what people tend to forget here, and then they ask for too little money, is you can usually ask for employer national insurance contributions. So that's not what's on the paycheck of your employee, but obviously that's what's coming out of your account. So that is an eligible cost, and pensions as well. So all costs associated with that employee. So don't forget to cost those, because they're eligible most of the time. What's typically not eligible are bonuses. Then secondly, equipment versus assets. So most of the time you can't really ask for funding for high value assets. So you can't buy your next lab or scale up fermenter or supercomputer. However, what normally you can buy are smaller items such as laptops. So if you wanted to do a big infrastructure investment, public funding might not be the route for that. However, if you just need small bits and bobs to run the project, that might be okay. And if you have assets, you can charge depreciation. You just have to ensure that you have a depreciation policy and you're really clear on the terms of a depreciation. And then finally, labor versus subcontract. So depending on whom you apply, CPI might come in as a subcontract, or you might choose to use other subcontractors. So when applying to NIHR, typically CPI comes in as a subcontract rather than a partner, just because that's the way these grants work. So it's really important to check with the partners that you want to work with on a grant application, to see whether they're eligible as grant partners or whether they have to come in as subcontractors. As subcontractors, typically you put their cost against your own cost, and then you will be able to claim back a certain percentage of that, just like all other costs that you incur. Next slide, please. Then what is also important for financial is that you are able to consider or communicate the costs associated with your innovation. So it's a good idea to prepare a best estimate cash flow projection for 5 years past project end, just to give funders confidence that you won't go bust the moment the funding ends. And then the main items to consider is the cost per unit, considering economies of scale, facilities and labor cost expectations. So are you going to hire after project end? Are you going to build new facilities or expand existing ones? Talk about revenue and profit margin expectations. So all grant funding is expecting you at some point to sell something and become profitable. So you can say within 3 years, we're expecting break even, or within 5 years, and we're expecting a margin of 10%, 20%, etc. So you just do business talk. And then finally, it's good to name your break-even point. Just again, it gives funders confidence, similar to investors, that you have a solid financial forecast. And really, I would recommend to look at the business plan literature here if people feel a bit wobbly, because that has all the tools you need. Next slide. So this is where we can move a little bit faster, because really what the next slides are about is just scenarios. Because funding, especially with Innovate UK, can get a bit complicated if you have more than one participant. So the most important thing to know is that most funders expect you to put in some money towards the grant. So they will reimburse 70% of the cost and 30% you have to cover yourself. So as a consequence, there will be a limit to how much you can ask for if you only have a certain amount of cash in the bank or available. Next slide. So the simplest scenario is 100% funding, no problem. And sometimes those grants are out there, 20,000, 40,000, sometimes 80,000. They run against state aid or the successor of that. So that's the jackpot. However, most of the time you're expected to put in 30%. So for example, if you have 50,000 cash in bank, that limits how much grant you can ask for, because you have to co-fund it. And you can calculate that. So in that case, it's if your funding rate or your co-funding rate is 30%, you divide 50,000 by 0.3, and that gives you the total project value. So you can cost up to a total project value of 166,667 if you're the only applicant, and that would then mean that at the 70% reimbursement rate, you can cover the remainder with cash. Now, next slide. It gets more complicated if you have partners. So if you partner, for example, with CPI, there's a cap on participation. So we have 2 times 30%. 30% is normally co-funding. Also, certainly, most of the time, there is a 30% cap on RTO and university participation. Completely different things. But it means that RTOs like CPI can only take up to 30% of the total project value. So we now have to coordinate who can claim how much and what the total project value should be. So it's again, you calculate how much you can co-fund. So say you can co-fund 50,000, that means your project value can be 166,000. And then if we say CPI can take 30% of that, you divide that by 0.7 and you get to 238,000. So it sounds a bit bonkers if you just talk through it, but the calculations aren't too difficult. And I would highly recommend to do these calculations just as a starting point for any project discussions, because then you can have some orientation of how much work can be done realistically in the project. Next slide, please. Oh, and should also mention RTOs and universities and charity work is normally 100% covered. So whereas you have to co-fund as a commercial entity, those costs are normally covered in full. So it's essentially free R&D. Next slide. And this is just to show that it can get even more complicated. So if you have a consortium where you might have 2 SMEs and an RTO partner, then both SMEs will count in this commercial pot, and the 30% of RTO counts against all commercial contribution. So it's a good way to bump up RTO budget if you had a competing commercial entity that you want to collaborate with. To say if one can co-fund 200,000, the other 100,000, that just means that it increases the pot for RTO and university work. So in this scenario, we're now looking at the much larger project value and consequently a much larger potential pot for RTOs, charities, and universities at 30%. Next slide. And then finally, it's just important to note most funding is awarded on a quarterly basis in arrears. So you get paid after the fact. And as a rule of thumb, you should be in a position to finance the proportion of the total project cost divided by project quotas upfront. If you go to the next slide, that will illustrate that. So if you're expecting a level spend, then there's no problem because you always have enough cash to pay for expenses. But if you have quite a bumpy cash flow as part of the project, it might actually knock you in debt temporarily. Because if you had a sudden £90,000 spend, of course you get 70% of that back, but it will take some time to recover from that. So if you only have £50,000 in the bank, it will be important to just have a reasonably smooth cash flow to not suddenly get hit by bumps, because you fund the whole thing up front and then get it back later. And I think the last one is just the bad weather one. The word of warning, if you are in financial difficulty or not liquid anymore, you're likely not eligible for public funding. So it's important to check that and be honest about it, because you might win a project and then get thrown out at due diligence. That's all on financials.
Right. So just to wrap up, it's how do you actually find the innovation funding? And I'm really just going to, in the interest of time, skip over these slides. The links are all in here. Basically, for your innovation type funding, Mike, if you just want to flick through for your innovation type funding with Innovate UK, there is a website which you'll have the link to. You can search that for all the funding opportunities that are there. I will say that at the moment, with the awaiting the outputs of a comprehensive spending review, there are very low levels of funding available and projects there. The next one would be Horizon Europe. Horizon Europe also has its own portal. You can search those. They will bring up all of the information as we've previously discussed that are attributed to each of those calls. Do read through all of the tabs that are included and all of the aspects that are included, because I think hopefully you've already got an appreciation for when you're pulling the grant together, there is a lot of effort that's required to make sure that everything is linked as a really coherent and strong value proposition for the government to invest in you, because that's ultimately what the grant is doing. For those that are at lower TRL levels, you know, it may be also looking, NIHR has a similar webpage. And for those that are looking at sort of some of the lower TRL levels, UKRI also looks at what research organization, what the research centers, you know, BBSRC, EPSRC, what sort of funding opportunities they have, which tend to be more of an academic nature. There are also private bid companies, you know, they might be sponsoring a grant, and typically, again, you'll have to look at the terms and conditions of those, because typically they will want some form of IP or to be able to commercialize whatever comes out of those. So do look carefully into them. At this point, I'll wrap up and we'll turn over for some questions. If anybody has any, we really do hope that you've enjoyed this presentation. We know it's been a lot of information, and I hope it's at least been useful in giving you an idea of the work that needs to go into a successful proposal, and also what you can do to actually increase your chances of winning proposals. So thank you all very much for having attended, and for those listening on the catch-up, I hope it's been useful. So.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah. So there was a question about the AI. I don't know if you guys can see it. Basically, I put it into the Q&A section. It's the can I or should I use AI to help with developing proposals? Then what do you guys think about that? I'm just gonna take the opportunity to kind of thank Susan, Sandra, and Mike for this very insightful presentation. I'm certainly impressed by the by your knowledge and expertise in this area. At the same time, it does look like a successful bid would require to follow a structured process. And I hope this is also useful for the audience and give you some guidance on how you can prepare for the public funding applications and then able to leverage the UK innovation support to help with your business development and growth. As Susan mentioned, there's certainly a lot of information to process and digest. The good thing is this webinar is recorded, and you will have the recording and you can revisit and share with others in due course. We do have another webinar coming up on Monday as part of the whole series, which is about building your innovation roadmap. If you're interested, you haven't signed up, please do. And also mentioned that early on, we do have 2 open days for next Thursday and the Monday 31st of March for different sites at CPI. So if you're interested, please sign up and also block your day for that. And the sign up link will be shared with the webinar recording together, and that should be with you soon. So yeah, I'll just hand it over back to you guys for a little bit more questions, Q&A session.
Yeah, I think in terms of AI, it's that landscape and the capabilities that exist with AI are developing rapidly, and the landscape changes a lot. My personal opinion on it is that you won't get what you need because your project is fundamentally tied to your intricate knowledge and development of where you want to get to and how you're going to exploit it in the market. I think what AI could do for you is help you to structure something. It may give you some headings that might be useful to help you follow something. But ultimately, I think you get into dangerous territory if you're just expecting AI to write it, because AI is based on what information is already publicly available. And if you're only building on what is publicly available, then it's unlikely that you're going to be able to show the niche aspects of what you're trying to do that's going to be new and different. So I think you really have to manage it with a grain of salt. Sandra is probably our strongest digital expert here. So, I'll hand it over to her and give her thoughts.
I would agree with that. We've even run little experiments to see what AI knows about bit writing, and it turns out it knows nothing about it. So I guess everyone is aware of the risk of hallucinations of AI. So once you start to go into factual territory, I just wouldn't touch it, because you think, like Susan said, you're the subject matter expert. It should take you just as long as AI to write down a reasonable marker scan or do that. And if you haven't done it yet, you should spend some time on it. And then the other element, of course, is that with AI, you might start to accidentally plagiarize content, although it's just relational. And also there are ways and means to tell whether something is AI generated. So I would be concerned that if funders start to get inundated by AI applications, there will at some point be a screening process to just say, if it's more than X% AI generated, forget it. So that's just my hypothesis. But it would be the only mechanism to deal with unmanageable amounts of applications. And then the other thing you should also say is that you don't really need AI for everything, because really the funder will be really clear on spelling out what's needed. So they will give you the questions to answer. They will give you 5 to 10 bullet points of what to address. So it's really simple to just follow them. And the surprising thing we often see is that people just read the overall question, ignore all the guidance, write something random, and then get a rubbish score. And really, this doesn't need AI. It just needs attention to detail. And I think, yeah, if you stick to the question, answer what's been asked, you should be golden. And AI might just introduce more problems into the process than benefits.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah.
I'll just quickly add one thing I could see potentially, because a lot of times the application forms will be very limited in terms of word count. So I could see potentially if you write something using your own knowledge, etc., but it's too long and you just want to shorten it. So you're not really using any new information, you're just kind of reformatting and restructuring. AI is really good at that. So the potential, as long as you read it back through and they've not introduced something different and they really got your meaning, but potentially that's something I'm going to be looking at, is whether you can just use it for sort of editing and making things come across more succinctly.
It still requires a lot of a human touch there, right? So okay.
And again, be careful that you then don't start to calibrate something that has been human generated into something that would be detected as AI generated. So it's, again, we don't really know how the field will pan out, but it's important to keep an eye on rules, because some funders might start to introduce a rule to not use AI.
So there's some risks to consider. Okay, great. Thanks for that. Yeah. Clara's also put a question there. There doesn't seem to be many opportunities with IUK at the moment. Do you have any insights into what we can expect in terms of opportunities this year?
I think we do understand that the SMART grants are probably going to come back in a completely different form. And that may look like there's sort of 3 different streams that look more at feasibility, which would mean smaller projects, but more awards. A medium stream that would have slightly larger projects, but less than they are today. Other than that, we really don't know. It really comes down to what's going to be supported within the comprehensive spending review. So keep your eye here. But one thing I would say is please don't be afraid of the failure. If it's extremely disappointing, and we know, we have your heart and soul into these grants, but success rates are dropping because there are more and more applications and more people seeking that. So again, that trend means that you need to be doing the homework up front and making your proposal strong. But if your proposal is not successful, it's wonderful because you will actually get feedback on what you have submitted, and you can use that to see from somebody else's point of view of looking at what you presented, how clearly it came across, or perhaps where some of the holes are. And that gives you the opportunity to make an even stronger application the next time. So it does cause a delay. We're aware of that, and everybody has a need for the funding and wants to get going as quickly as they can. But, it's being aware of what the funding landscape is like and looking at what advantages you can get from it. And failure is certainly a wonderful teacher sometimes, and it can prove really valuable for like a future round.
I agree. Yeah, Clara, I hope that answers some of the question there. I'm conscious of time. We're a little bit over, and thanks very much for staying. As mentioned, we'll send out the recording. You might still have our contact detail via the previous sort of email communication. If you do have any other questions, please feel free to kind of come back to us, and we'll try to help as much as we can. So if there's no further questions, I'll just take a quick check at the message and the Q&A session. Yeah, that looks like pretty much it. So yeah, thanks so much for attending. And then all the presenters, thanks so very much, and they definitely deserve a drink and then have some break there for sure. And then all the rest of you have a good weekend, and all the best.
Thank you very much.
Take care. Bye-bye, everyone.
Thanks.